The clink of silver cutlery sounded too loud in the villa, a precise, polite echo that belonged to conversations that no longer filled the room. One chair at the head of the long table was occupied, its leather pressed and familiar. The other 11 sat empty, polished, and patient. A single candle guttered where a centerpiece once rose in bouquets and laughter. Daniel Whitmore sat with his hands folded in his lap, the crease of his suit untouched, a suit that had carried him through meetings and mergers and other people's triumphs, but had never learned how to shelter a small, insistent grief. He watched the sunlight make a bright, narrow stripe across the table and thought, with the blunt honesty of someone who had lived long enough to lose the shape of things, that birthdays could be measured in the absence left behind. Today was his 42nd. The calendar had a dozen polite reminders from committees and clients. The house had only a child's drawing thumbtacked to the silver-framed portrait of his late wife. Sophie burst into the dining room like a hand turning on a light. Her knees were still scabbed with the day's playing. Her hair had been braided wrong and then hurried into a loose knot. At 6, she did not know the rituals of sorrow. She only knew the small economies of hope, and she had spent the last half hour saving up the most useful things she owned. "Daddy!" she announced, as though presenting a found treasure. She climbed into the empty chair opposite him without waiting for permission. Her feet dangled. "Young lady," she said, tipping her head toward the coat check by the front hall, where a neighbor was standing uncertainly, "my father is very lonely. Could you come to the party and pretend we're a family?" The words landed like a pebble thrown into still water. Daniel's throat tightened, not from the thought of the party, he had resigned himself to small numbers and smaller candles, but because Sophie had found the one person in the street who still believed she could arrange the world into something new and true. The neighbor, a woman in a second-hand coat who smelled faintly of lemon and old paper, blinked as though she had been given an unexpected role in a play. She was too young to be an actress, maybe too old to be a stranger. Her name was Maya. The way Sophie said it, "young lady," made the title affectionate rather than formal, and the woman laughed, surprised and gentle. "I don't know about that," Maya said, and there was room in her "don't know" for the emergency of an answer. She had been sitting on a park bench 2 hours earlier, hands deep in the pockets of a cardigan with one moth hole and a lifetime of small kindnesses threaded into it, watching pigeons and thinking about a job application she wasn't sure anyone wanted to read. Teaching had been steady, then not steady. Rooms full of children had roared with need and tenderness until one day she no longer fit in the frame the school offered. She'd left with a box of chalk and a heart that preferred simple trades, pancakes, stories, a gait that matched a child's. She looked at Daniel, at Sophie, at the empty chairs like islands, and, with no small amount of self-surprise, said yes. It was not a grand decision. It came folded in the ordinary generosity of a stranger who would rather see a child smile than be praised for a well-made plan. "I can come," she told Sophie. "I'll wear a dress." Sophie clapped, small palms on the table, a sound like cotton bouncing on wood. Daniel, who spent his life calibrating tone and outcomes, heard something rearrange itself inside him. The offer was ridiculous and brave, inconvenient and saving. He had expected friends to step forward, old colleagues to send flowers, a distant cousin to stand where a partner should have been. He had not expected this plain, immediate answering of a small, honest need. Sophie reached across the table and took Maya's hand with the solemnity of someone passing a sacred object. "Bring a song," she said. Maya smiled fully now. She had songs. She had a voice that could calm the most stubborn child. She had also an aversion to being anyone's temporary solution. She knew the fatigue of being a placeholder from a past life where transient had been written across many of her accomplishments. She promised, because promises made to 6-year-olds bind differently. Afterward, on the short walk back to her apartment, Maya texted Wanda. Wanda, who could turn a dramatic choice into a punchline and then make it purchasably useful. "I said yes," she wrote. Wanda's reply arrived like a weather alert and a cheer. "That's either the bravest thing you've done or the stupidest. Keep me posted. Coffee tomorrow?" Maya thought of coffee and sleep, and then of Sophie's earnest hand. She thought of the way Daniel had looked at the stripe of sunlight as though measuring something he had lost. She had been asked, no, selected, by a person who saw her not as a resume, but as an answer. That kind of choosing was rare. It mattered. When Maya arrived at the Whitmore house later that afternoon, the doorman, a man with a face like a small sentence, led her through a space that smelled of jasmine and lemon polish. The house had a careful silence. No toys abandoned on the stairs, no crumb trails. Everything was arranged to show that a life was orderly and therefore recoverable. Annabelle Whitmore, Daniel's mother, met her at the threshold. Annabelle was a woman made of rules and roses, a social matriarch habitually dressed as though she might host a luncheon for an embassy at any hour. Her hands were kept neat by habit, her eyes kept neat by habit too. "You must be Maya," Annabelle said, the phrase both identification and test. She measured the young woman's clothes. Simple, clean, not designed to impress. And the way Maya met her gaze, without flinching. Maya gave the short introduction she always gave, where she'd been trained to teach, how she had left, and what she wanted now. She said it without the defensive neatness people expected. There was no explanation for the moth hole in her favorite cardigan. There was no need to have one. Annabelle's smile did not find it endearing. "We appreciate what Sophie did," Annabelle said, the ridge of her words gentle but firm. "Experimentation is charming at 6. At 26, it becomes unsettling." "She's 6, Daniel said, stepping into the foyer. He had changed his suit to something softer for the afternoon, sleeves rolled to his forearms as if that small domestic concealment might save the day. Around him, staff moved like a quiet orchestra. Charlie, the housekeeper, offered Maya a nod that carried the authority of long memory and warm assessment. "Thank you for coming," Daniel said. He was saying more than the words. He had not expected to have to ask a stranger to inhabit a lie for a few hours. When he asked, though, he felt the heavy honesty of the request. "We don't often," he hesitated, because people like him usually had curated help and curated allies, and now had to improvise in the public light of a child's imagination. "I can stay for the afternoon," Maya said. She kept one foot in the realm of temporary that would protect her from being exploited, from becoming a steady hand where steady hands were not wanted. She asked, gently, what Sophie wanted the woman to be like. "Kind," Sophie said immediately, "and able to reach the high shelf." "You can reach the high shelf?" Maya asked, and Sophie puffed up, delighted. "Sometimes," Sophie allowed. They arranged it like a small play. Maya would come, bring a song, and sit at the table. Daniel would sit opposite and be told, by Sophie, with the certainty only a child can wield, that they were a family for the afternoon. It was a mockery, but it felt like rehearsal for a new truth. At the party, such as it was, a small gathering of 3, a cake with enough frosting to be indulgent, plates that clicked with an attempt at ceremony, Maya fit into the role with the ease of someone who had spent years reading the cues of children and adults alike. She forgot the theater class of her youth and simply did what she did best, watched for the small signal, and provided the shelter it asked for. Sophie taught everyone how to play the party. She declared it necessary to wear mismatched socks at birthday parties because it was more fun that way. She insisted on singing twice and clapped so loudly after the first chorus that even Annabelle's veneer unseated into a smile. Daniel laughed, soft, a sound he had not yet got used to hearing in the house where his wife used to laugh. And for a few minutes the villa breathed easier. The 11 empty chairs felt less like accusation and more like a promise that could one day be filled again. At the party, such as it was, a small gathering of three, a cake with enough frosting to be indulgent, plates that clicked with an attempt at ceremony, Maya fit into the role with the ease of someone who had spent years reading the cues of children and adults alike. She forgot the theater class of her youth and simply did what she did best, watched for the small signal and provided the shelter it asked for. Sophie taught everyone how to play the party. She declared it necessary to wear mismatched socks at birthday parties because it was more fun that way. She insisted on singing twice and clapped so loudly after the first chorus that even Annabelle's veneer unseated into a smile. Daniel laughed, soft, a sound he had not yet got used to hearing in the house where his wife used to laugh, and for a few minutes the villa breathed easier. The 11 empty chairs felt less like accusation and more like a promise that could one day be filled again. The party ended with a voice that had been quieter than the rest. "Will you come tomorrow?" Daniel asked Maya as the last of the frosting was scraped and the plates stacked. He had not meant to ask for continuity, he had meant only to extend a courtesy. But the question held his entire day's loneliness in its simple pitch. Maya hesitated. The limits she kept were part protection, part self-preservation. "I can't make promises," she said. "I need to know what this would be, if it's a one-time thing or a job." Daniel considered the way his mother's eyes were in the room, the way Charlie had registered each small gesture, the careful balance of vulnerability and propriety. He had built his life on contracts and commitments. Asking for help in the space between had felt like drafting a new kind of agreement, one without a lawyer. "Part-time," he said after a beat. "Paid. We can discuss terms." He glanced at Annabelle, who controlled her face with practiced precision. "If you're willing." Maya nodded. She set a condition that felt necessary, honesty with Sophie. "I won't pretend to be something I'm not," she said. "I'll say I'm a friend who helps. Sophie deserves truth." "I agree," Daniel said. The agreement was small but steady. It let them build on a foundation that respected Sophie's right to know. Charlene Brooks, Charlie, took Maya under her wing with the practical warmth of someone who had been the housekeeper in the family since Daniel was a child. Charlie showed Maya where Sophie's pajamas were, where the storybooks lined up by size and spine color in the hallway, the cupboard full of tea labeled with small, careful sticky notes. She told Maya the schedules that mattered, Sophie's nap after lunch, the moment she liked to arrange the blocks in the living room, and the way she hummed when she was worried. "You remember the name of the lullaby?" Charlie asked in the kitchen, handing Maya a plate of pancakes like a peace offering. Maya nodded. The song wasn't learned in schools. It had been taught to her by an old neighbor when she was 11 and had no family of her own to call home. She hummed the melody softly while Sophie scraped syrup from the bowl, and the tune slid into the corners like sunlight. Daniel, who had been standing by the doorway, closed his eyes for a second. The melody fit him like a missing glove. Days slipped into routines as quietly as laundry cycles. Maya came for a few hours in the mornings at first, pancake batter and the small ceremony of butter spreading over warm rounds. Sophie learned songs from Maya and taught her to braid hair properly. Together, they went to the greenhouse, a small, glassed-in room at the back of the estate that Daniel's wife had cherished. It smelled of damp earth and citrus. There were herbs hanging in strings and a shelf of clay pots with names scratched into them. The greenhouse was where trust planted itself. Maya showed Sophie how to press a seed into soil with the right pressure so it wouldn't be too deep and so it wouldn't sit cold. Sophie, with her earnest face and earnest hands, took the task with a solemnity that made even Daniel slow down, watching as if the act of planting might repair something larger than the plot. Annabelle watched these small scenes with a narrowed eye at first. She had not offered Maya any soft words. Protection had a different face in her. "Be careful," she told Maya one morning, as the two women bent over a pot together and Sophia fetched a watering can. "The more sacred the space, the more damage when someone walks out of it." It was not exactly malice. It was the reasonable skepticism of someone whose life had been devoted to preserving a lineage and the conditions under which it could thrive. She worried about appearances and the reputational risks of hurried attachments. She worried about anything that might destabilize Sophie's world. Maya accepted the warning with the quiet diplomacy of someone who had lived long enough to know that admonitions came from fear. "I understand," she said. "I don't want to be a storm." "Good," Annabel replied, with a tone that contained relief, like a valve closing. Between the quiet watches of the house and the deliberate chores of the staff, small intimacies grew, unremarked, unheralded, like the first green hairs in a potted bulb. Daniel played the piano sometimes in the evenings. It was a private thing, practiced and careful, an old routine that had outlived the listening ears meant for it. One night, he sat in the music room, fingers hesitant at the keys, and Maya, who had been putting Sophie to bed, lingered by the doorway. Sophie asked for a lullaby, and Daniel offered a melody that was more memory than song. Maya, without thinking, added a harmony. It was not planned, it was an instinct, the ease of two voices finding a comfortable counterpoint. The sound filled the corridor and softened corners that had been left stiff with silence. Daniel's playing changed. His wrists relaxed, the notes held less like statements and more like invitations. They never spoke of romance, not in the early days. There was a civility to the way they kept their lives separate. Schedules on the fridge, notations about bills and vet appointments, and the exact time to pick Sophie from school. Yet there were moments, stolen glances by the greenhouse sink, the way their hands brushed as they passed a plate of toast, that hinted at something more. Small gestures that anyone would see as possible seeds and not promises. Maya's life rearranged itself without her making a formal plan. She found herself arriving early to prepare pancakes, staying late to fold a laundry basket into shape. She received a small check on Fridays, an allowance that made it possible for her to keep her modest apartment and buy the kind of groceries she had stopped treating herself to. She liked the way Sophie said, "friend," when she introduced Maya to other children at the playground. She liked how the word filled the room like a lamp. Daniel's life, too, rearranged. The villa's rooms no longer seemed like museums of what had been. They became livable places, with crumbs and toys. He began to take walks with Sophie in the evenings, the three of them forming a tiny parade down streets softened by lamplight. At night, he would sometimes stand at Sophie's bedroom door and listen to Maya humming while she straightened the blanket. He found himself staying at home on nights he might usually have gone to dinners. Leaving had once been his default. Staying was a practice he learned only through repetition. Charlene watched all of this with a pragmatic tenderness. She tended to Sophie with the authority of someone who'd been trusted by generations. "She's settled," Charlie told Annabel once, in the kitchen where the lemon polish lived and the tea was brewed the same way every day. "Sophie has a steady hand now. The child is happy." Annabel's face softened in a way that would not have been easy to stage. She could see what the other saw. Sophie radiant in a way that had not been possible the last 2 birthdays. It didn't erase her worries, but it made them smaller. In the quiet of a late afternoon, Daniel found himself alone with Maya in the greenhouse. The glass fogged gently as rain tapped the panes, and the smell of wet soil rose between them. Sophie had run off to chase a puddle, and Charlie was methodically cleaning silver somewhere in the house. For a moment, the world narrowed to the two of them and the soft soundtrack of the rain. "You're good with her," Daniel said, not because he needed to flatter her, but because he needed to say the thing. It mattered to him, more than he could explain, to hear the assessment in someone else's words. Maya shrugged, rolling a seed between thumb and finger. She had an education in small salvations, teaching a child to read, teaching a child to trust. "She tells me what to be," she answered. "Mostly I just remember the songs." Daniel fiddled with a pot rim as if it were a stock certificate. "Do you ever think about staying longer than this arrangement?" Maya's answer was careful. "I think about where I am useful," she said. I don't want to be someone's repair kit. No, Daniel said quietly. I wouldn't ask that. I only... He stopped. The words in his chest unraveled into something that sounded like fear. I don't want her to learn what I learned, that people leave when it's inconvenient. Maya's hands stilled. There was a pain in his admission that didn't feel like weakness. It felt like surrender. Around them, the greenhouse hummed with life. Aphids on a leaf, a spider weaving a small geometrical life in the corner. It was an ordinary world, which was precisely what both of them craved. I'll stay, she said finally. It was neither a vow nor a contract. It was a promise that had weight because it had cost her control. For as long as it takes for Sophie to be safe and certain. The months that followed were not cinematic arcs of romance and resolution. They were instead a careful accumulation of ordinary acts. Grocery runs where Sophie chose the cereal with cartoon animals, the way Daniel learned to braid hair sloppily but earnestly, the ritual of a Saturday market where Maya bought a jar of local honey and insisted on letting Sophie taste the spoon. Neighbors started to notice. A woman on Daniel's street saw Sophie holding Maya's hand and smiled the small smile of someone who keeps track of community. The local bookseller began to reserve a shelf of picture books for Sophie and friends. Nothing grand happened, nothing boomed. The world adjusted in small degrees. Yet not everything in the house yielded to these small parenthetical joys. Annabelle continued to watch, and with watching came questions she could not quite set down. She worried about stability in ways that felt practical, not petty. She had seen families rearrange themselves in the face of grief, and had seen the fractures that followed when haste replaced care. "What's her history?" Annabelle asked one morning over tea, more curious than accusatory. "She taught for a while," Charlie answered, curling the edge of a napkin. "Left to travel, then came back, good with children." Annabelle folded the napkin and looked at Maya's handwriting on the suggestion box, neat, small loops for the G's. It was a curiosity that would not dissolve into the contentment of the others. She was, in her own way, protecting Sophie. On a rainy Wednesday, Daniel's phone buzzed while he was at the kitchen island, with Sophie standing on a stool stirring batter and humming the tune Maya had taught her. He glanced at the screen and saw an email with a subject that slid his chest cold. Request for information. It was from a law firm's receptionist asking to schedule a courtesy call. The message was curt, bureaucratic, no hint of menace in its syntax. But the words were enough to make a man who guarded his life with contracts sit down on the nearest chair as if the room had become a small boat. He read it twice, then a third time, as if repetition might alter the content. Then he placed the phone face down on the table and did something he had not done in months. He let the quiet of the kitchen swell until it filled the space between him and Sophie, who looked up at him with the wide, clear concern of a child who knew she had caused nothing and yet felt the pressure of adults rearranging. "Everything okay?" she asked, flourishing the spoon. "Yes," Daniel said. He lied, not because he had to protect her from the truth, but because he did not yet have words that were honest and final. "It's probably nothing." Later that night, after Sophie had been tucked in and the house had softened into the noise of distant traffic, Daniel sat with Maya in the sitting room. The rain had left a clean glaze on the window, and their reflections looked like two people framed in a painting. He told her about the email in low sentences. No panic, only the acknowledgement that the house had been nudged. "It could be business," Maya suggested. She believed in the mundane explanations. It steadied her to do so. "Perhaps," Daniel said, "but I'm not naive. Grief can be visible in ways that drag attention." Maya listened. She had come into his life as a temporary anchor and was finding herself drawn into the longer, more complicated task of standing by him in the dark. She felt the shift not like a sudden wind, but like a root unfurling below the surface. "We'll handle it," she said simply. "We handle things." Daniel's hand found hers across the coffee table. It wasn't a gesture of seduction. It was a small human agreement, the clasping of two people who had chosen presence in a tentative covenant. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked, and the sound stitched itself into the room's quiet like a stitch in a hem. They did not yet know how big the fuss would become. They did not yet know the reach of a rumor, the appetite of a blog for a single photograph, or the legal procedures that might follow when someone from the past reappeared to ask for answers. They only knew the present. Pancakes stacked on a plate, Sophie asleep with a strand of hair across her forehead, a greenhouse full of damp promise, and a line of chairs waiting to be filled. And then, a week after the dinner where Daniel had first asked her to come again, a plain envelope was left on the mat by the front door, a courier's message delivered with a wary efficiency. Daniel opened it, standing in the doorway, the house breathing around him like a creature at his back. Inside was a letter, on the kind of stationery that suggested formality without melodrama. A short statement requesting contact regarding a matter concerning Sophie. No accusations, no drama, only the neatness of something official. Daniel read it once, then twice. He folded the paper with care and looked up at Maya, who had come to the entrance when she heard the flap of the envelope. Sophie's boots were wet by the door. Her small voice asked from the stairwell if she might have another slice of toast. The ordinary demands of family life threaded themselves through the sudden, clinical sign of paperwork. "We should tell Sophie," Maya said softly. The sentence was not alarmist. It was an ethic she had always carried with children. Truth, measured and tailored, but truth nonetheless. Daniel agreed. "Tomorrow," he said. He felt the way hope and duty braided together in his chest, creating a tightness that was equal parts fear and determination. He slid the letter into a protective folder and placed it in his briefcase with the others. They told Sophie, later that day, with as much simple framing as they could. "Someone from the court wants to talk to the family and make sure everyone's safe and happy," Maya said, because that was true and it kept the details small. Sophie nodded solemnly, as if she understood the parts that concerned her. By the time Mary Lennox, the guardian ad litem the court appointed, the villa was running nearly the way it had settled into its new rhythm. Mary was neither officious nor warm. She had the practical compassion of someone whose job required both. She carried a small notebook and a demeanor that set children at ease. No accidental interrogation, only patient curiosity. She spent an afternoon moving through the house like someone following a scent. The way Sophie came to the window when someone knocked, the quick method by which the blocks were lined up by color, the steady supply of snacks placed where a 6-year-old could reach them. Mary watched Daniel as he answered questions, his cadence measured and economical, the language of someone used to negotiation. She watched Maya while the two of them read a story on the living room rug, the way Maya followed Sophie's attention from page to page, never rushing a pause. She played a game with Sophie in the garden. They'd planted a small basil sprig together, and in an hour, Sophie had taught Mary 2 songs and the exact knot she preferred on her shoelace. At the end of the visit, in the foyer, Mary looked at all of them, as if making a calculation that involved temperament and evidence and the small deposits of care. "I'll write up my recommendation," she told Daniel. "It will take time. My first impression is concerned with Sophie's stability. She seems rooted." That word, rooted, carried weight. It suggested soil, continuity, the faith that someone would water a plant and not abandon it mid-cycle. Daniel let it sit in his chest like a necessary thing that could be reported and relied upon. But around the edges, the world had already begun to narrate differently. A local blog had picked up a photograph. Someone from a charity event on the street had taken a shot of Maya with Sophie outside the park and posted it with a caption that invited speculation. Who is the woman in Sophie's life? The article accumulated comments like small infections. A gossip column linked to it with breezier certainty. Before long, the story had the momentum that anonymous outrage lends itself to. A missing mother, a new woman, questions raised, lines drawn. Annabelle read the headlines with a kind of concentration that looked a bit like pain. She was careful to not say anything she would later regret in front of Sophie. There were ways to express worry in private, and she took them. "They'll want proof of stability," she told Daniel that evening over a cup of green tea. "Proof of employment, references, background checks, all of it done and in order. I will assist." Her help came in the form she knew best: lists, professional addresses, an acquaintance at a firm who could recommend a reputable solicitor. There was a gentleness in her insistence that was not always visible under the armor of her social alacrity. She fretted less about the blog's tone than about the reality of showing up in court with a set of facts that would reassure those whose job it was to decide. Heather, when she reappeared, arrived in a way that made sense only because life does not choreograph these things to make anyone comfortable. She wasn't cinematic. No sudden, perfectly timed rain or dramatic courtroom entrance. She was a woman whose name Sophie had heard whispered in the foyer, who stood on the threshold one gray morning with a paper bag in her hand and a voice that reached the cusp between apology and request. "Hello," she said. Her hair had been grown out in a way that suggested a person who'd been reshaping herself. There were lines around her mouth that softened when she smiled the way someone smiles and hopes not to be judged. She said her name carefully, as if placing each syllable in the room and hoping it would be accepted. Daniel let the house take a breath before he invited her in. Annabelle had insisted they meet in the sitting room with the door open and Charlie nearby. There was a practical choreography to how they positioned themselves. Heather acknowledged them all with a glance that included Sophie, and Sophie, who had been coaxed into sitting on the piano bench, met Heather's gaze with the blank, honest curiosity only a child can hold. "I didn't want to alarm you," Heather said. I'm here because I want to be a part of Sophie's life again. I know I missed things. The words stumbled into a directness that felt like someone trying to climb back onto a bridge. "I made mistakes," she said. "I've been getting help. I didn't know how to do better before. I'm trying to now." It was not an explanation that absolved. It was not even necessarily one that would convince, but it was an opening. Daniel's first instinct, a private, protective knot, was to shield Sophie. Maya's instinct was quieter. She listened for what Heather's presence would do to the child, how the child would register it. Annabelle watched for the practicalities: proof of attendance at programs, letters from counselors, a stable residence. Heather left the house with a promise to follow the proper channels: papers, a counsel, a plan. She filed the petition for visitation through the lawyer who had already reached out. The formal process began, precise and unromantic. It read to Daniel like a test that would call them all to show their cards. The media noticed. The blog that had run the neighborhood photo ran an expanded piece with Heather's side of the story, the personal struggles, the desire to reconnect. The tone became, predictably, both prying and human. There was outrage on one side and expressed sympathy on the other, and in between, the facts of Sophie's comfort bumped up against the public appetite for narrative arcs. A camera outside the courthouse the day the first hearing was scheduled filmed the Whitmore gate as if there were a single, simple tale to tell. Mary's report, when it came, was quietly emphatic. Her language was professional but human. She noted that Sophie exhibited an affectionate attachment to Maya, that the household routines were stable, that Daniel engaged as a parent who had learned to practice presence, that supervised contact for Heather could be considered given evidence of effort toward stability. It was not a command, but an observation with a heart in it. The judge set a preliminary schedule, a period of mediation and supervised visitation to be structured by the court, an assessment of Heather's readiness for unsupervised time, and a timeline for home evaluations and background checks. The tone from the bench was measured. The law, in its slow and sober way, described its aims: Sophie's welfare paramount, the child's need for continuity recognized, the parent's rights acknowledged with the caveat of responsibility. The days of legal attention pressed on the household in small ways. There were forms to gather. Has Heather had stable housing? Are there references? What are the records of any interventions? Can she demonstrate participation in programs? Annabelle, in the quietness of her kitchen, assembled a folder of documents on behalf of Daniel: proof of employment, a schedule of childcare, a list of household staff who could serve as references. It was administrative armor. Maya wrapped herself in work. The improvised safety she had offered Sophie had deepened into an obligation she had taken on willingly. She prepared crafts for the supervised visits. She learned the names of the therapists the court recommended. She filled out forms for background checks. And she sat with Sophie and read the books Mary had suggested for children experiencing family changes. There were moments when the worry arrived in the very small hours, and she would make herself tea and listen to Sophie's breathing in the next room to find steadiness. Heather's participation in the supervised schedule began with an awkward civility. The first visit took place in a room at a community center where a caseworker sat between them and recorded the meeting with both note and the quiet watchfulness of the professional. Sophie arrived with Daniel and Maya. The child watched as if measuring whether the world would hold. Heather entered with the carefulness of someone learning an instrument. She brought a small painted rock. Sophie loved painted stones, and Sophie accepted it with the automatic generosity of a child who can hold more than one affection. They spoke in fits and starts. Heather attempted to apologize in forms that a 6-year-old could hold. "I am sorry I missed your birthdays," she said. Sophie listened, then changed the subject to whether the rock could be used as a paperweight for a drawing. The caseworker noted the exchange clinically and then gently encouraged Heather to ask Sophie about school, about favorite games, to practice small, reliable interactions. Over time, weeks turned into a sequence of visits. At first, Heather arrived with uncertain punctuality. Later, the appointments became a part of her schedule. She brought small things and then things that suggested consistency: a library card that matched the address she had supplied, a note from a case manager verifying attendance at a support program. She practiced being present in the room with a child who did not owe her anything and who could decide, in small and honest ways, what to give. For Maya, watching Heather's measured efforts was both a relief and a test. Relief because the situation was not simply an abrupt invasion. It was a process in which Heather was, at least somewhat, trying. The test lay in the question of boundaries: how to allow someone back into a life without allowing them to destabilize it. Maya navigated this with a steady hand. She did not offer praise for every small progress, but she also did not deny the possibility of redemption. She protected Sophie by setting limits and by insisting on transparency. Maya remained present during supervised visits, not as an antagonist, but as a guardian of the child's sense of security. Public interest ebbed and flowed. Photographs of Sophie and Maya at a community garden, Marcus, the gardener in the background. One of the neighborhood's small magazines ran a soft profile piece about community mothers and included a throwaway line about the unfolding legal process. The public appetite, which had promised to be voracious and hungry for scandal, proved in many small ways to be fickle. The more ordinary the story, the less it satisfied sensational headlines. There were dark pockets, however. An anonymous commenter suggested that Maya was overreaching in the role she played. An insensitive headline implied that the Whitmores were trying to block Heather. These things came and went, but every headline lesioned Annabelle a little. She read them and scowled, and then turned back to making lists of verifiable facts. The day the mediation was scheduled, the Whitmore sitting room hummed with a different intensity. Daniel and Maya sat on a low sofa. Annabelle conducted herself with the business precision that had been her life's instrument. Heather arrived with her lawyer, a sober woman who carried a folder like someone who could manage risk. The mediator set ground rules: focus on Sophie's needs, prioritize continuity, be honest about capabilities and boundaries. Heather spoke plainly about regret and effort. She did not make grand promises. She made smaller ones that were verifiable. I will attend X program. I will provide X references. I am committed to the terms of supervised visitation. Daniel, for his part, listened, then spoke of Sophie's daily needs, his own ability to provide them, and the importance he placed on structure. Maya contributed by talking about the daily rituals that sustain Sophie: song at bedtime, the greenhouse routine, a certain way of tucking in a blanket, that would be impacted by the scheduling of visits and that should be considered in any plan. The mediator took notes and made recommendations. They all left a little more aligned on the practicalities. Still, the legal path was not only a matter of paperwork. There were hearings where testimony mattered. The court allowed a guardian ad litem's recommendation weight, but the parent's testimony and the child's needs were central. The local blog obtained a tape of one of the mediations, surreptitiously, a recording posted with a misleading headline. The leak caused outrage among the parties. The court admonished press overreach and the blog removed the clip, but the ripple remained. It served as a reminder that privacy could be porous when the public's curiosity deemed a family story marketable. When the day for evidentiary hearings arrived, the courthouse felt like a separate, quieter city. Daniel, dressed in the kind of sober clothing that suggested seriousness, not display. Maya chose a dress that was simple and tidy, and she carried with her a folder of notes about Sophie's school progress, photographs of the greenhouse with Sophie crouched over it, letters from Charlie about routine, and the guardian ad litem's report. Heather arrived with a lawyer and with tangible proof of steps she had taken: letters from counselors, a lease agreement showing stable housing, attendance records from a support group. Each item was a small claim on the possibility of reconnection. The courtroom moved by the steady, formal rhythms of procedure. The judge asked clear, measured questions about Sophie's best interests. Daniel's attorney presented the case: evidence that Daniel provided a stable routine, that Maya played an integral caregiving role that contributed to Sophie's well-being, and that Heather had made steps toward reestablishing contact, but had a period of absence that required the court to monitor reintegration for Sophie's best interest. Heather's attorney argued for expanded visitation in a measured plan based on her client's progress. Heather herself was permitted to speak in words appropriate to her role. She expressed sorrow and a wish to be involved. She did not make promises she could not keep. She made commitments she hoped the court would monitor and verify. The judge listened with an even expression, absorbing the facts and the human tones. When the court allowed Maya to testify, she did so with a calm that surprised even her. She told, plainly, about mornings, how Sophie liked the pancake batter made a certain way, how certain songs soothed her to sleep, how the greenhouse had become a place where Sophie learned to care for things smaller than herself. She spoke of the child's laughter and of the small behavioral shifts that came with consistent care. The way Sophie now slept through the night most evenings, the way she recounted school events with secure delight. She never overstepped into claiming parental rights. She described what had been observed and what it had meant to Sophie. Heather spoke about her absence with a humility that had the texture of truth. No grand flourishes, only a steady recounting of error and the work she had undertaken. She did not demand immediate, unsupervised access. She requested a path to rebuild trust. The judge asked about the practicalities: housing, counseling, support networks. Heather offered sincere answers and documents to back them up. There were professionals who testified. Mary Lennox reiterated the home's stability and Sophie's apparent attachment to Maya. Charlie described daily schedules and rituals that supported the child's well-being. The court weighed each testimony like a ledger. In his final remarks, Daniel did not plead dramatic appeals. He looked at the judge and spoke of his obligations, of the fact that he loved his daughter and wanted a plan that both protected her and allowed for a possible relationship with her mother should that relationship be shown to be safe and steady. The judge listened, then retired to consider the various inputs with the deliberative patience the law demands. When the ruling came, it did not offer the neat finality that gossip often seeks. The judge granted primary custody to Daniel, citing the established routines and Sophie's best interests. Heather was granted a path toward expanded visitation, beginning with supervised contact and expanding to unsupervised visits if she met specific, verifiable criteria over a set period. Importantly, the judge recognized the role Maya had played and granted a formal acknowledgement of legal guardianship pending standard background checks and the fulfillment of administrative requirements. An interim recognition that allowed Maya to participate in school decisions and certain medical consents while the adoption process was considered. The judge emphasized the child's welfare as the guiding principle and urged all parties to prioritize Sophie's stability over public narratives. The ruling was not a victory in the sensational sense. It was a careful, juridical allocation of responsibility that left room for future possibilities. Heather, for her part, accepted the ruling with visible restraint. The court's decision gave her a clear roadmap, boundaries that could either enable or bar access depending on adherence. She left with paperwork and a sense of what she needed to prove in order to be more present. In the days that followed, the household exhaled weakly, and then began to breathe in the steadier rhythm that comes after a storm. There was relief and an anxious aftertaste, both present and moving. The legal decision meant more trips to the school, forms signed, and checks complied with. But it also meant Sophie could go to bed with the same lullaby and the same routine as before, and that she had adults who had stood by her in a formal way. Months pulled themselves into a pattern of quiet work. Maya completed the background checks and filled out the forms for guardianship ascension. She met with a counselor the court recommended to ensure she could articulate and carry out the responsibilities that would come with more legal recognition. Annabelle, who had watched events with suspicion and protective caution, began to show a softer regard. Small gestures of courtesy, a plate of mince pies placed gently in Maya's hands at the holiday table, a compliment on her steady ways. Heather continued on her path with measurable consistency. She showed up for supervised visits with a notebook and a commitment to learn and practice the small rituals that mattered to the child. Asking about school projects, not promising things she couldn't deliver, being on time. When she missed an appointment, she apologized and explained. When she arrived early with a small drawing she had made for Sophie, the child accepted it and displayed it on the mantel, where it sat alongside other artifacts of a life forming itself. Maya discovered that legal recognition did not change the intimacy of the tasks she loved. She still braided hair badly and laughed when Sophie corrected her. She still made pancakes that browned at the edges and hummed songs she had been taught by someone who once offered her the kind of care that saved her from the loneliness she was prone to. The checks and forms had given her a thin band of security. The everyday acts, stacked, produced the thicker cord of belonging. The adoption itself, when it came, meant more than paperwork. It arrived not as a sudden sweep of fate, but as a small procession of people who mattered. A judge who had watched the case with care, a couple of neighbors, Charlie and Annabelle in a seat near the front, Daniel wearing a soft, nervous smile, and Sophie in a dress that looked as if it had been chosen with the particular gravity only a child can summon. Maya stood with hands that trembled only briefly. The ceremony was less a theatrical declaration than a naming of what had already been true. The judge spoke of commitments and care and the social recognition of the bond that had been nurtured. There were tissues, understated congratulations, and a sense that the legal form had finally caught up to an emotional reality that had been in place for months. Heather, present that day, sat at the edge of the room and clapped politely when Sophie joined hands with Maya. She had been given the space by the court to observe from a distance. She accepted the terms with a quiet that suggested continued work rather than triumph. After the papers were signed, there was a small reception in the greenhouse, where everyone gathered around long, mismatched tables. It was the sort of gathering that felt, on purpose, like a family reunion of choice. Neighbors, staff, a few colleagues, and friends. Wanda among them, cheeks flushed with pride and helpful gossip. Wanda had brought a tart that she declared would set the world right. People talked about small things, Sophie's new favorite book, a recipe Daniel had finally learned, Charlie's steadfast competence. Annabel, who had been cautious throughout, raised a glass in a precise, careful toast that carried warmth beneath its formality. It was the kind of speech she had given for other occasions, but the warmth now had a different, earned quality. The planting of the green Whitmore garden became the symbolic act that sealed the new shape of their lives. The community had been invited. Neighbors who brought small cups of soil, a few schoolmates from Sophie's class who planted seeds in paper cups, and a representative from the neighborhood association who presented a plaque they'd sponsored. They dug a hole in the center of a plot of reconditioned earth and placed an orange sapling, small, root-balled, and bright with new leaves, into the soil. The plaque read, simply, "Green Whitmore Garden, for every beginning that blooms from love." Sophie insisted on making the first ceremonial watering, and she did so with a seriousness that made everyone smile. Annabel took a shovelful of dirt and, with the slight awkwardness of someone who had never gardened professionally, joined in. Daniel stood back with his hands in his pockets, the way people sometimes hold themselves when feeling larger feelings, and watched as roots were covered and promises were triangulated by neighbors and friends. Heather stood a little apart, watching the scene. She did not approach the planting directly. Instead, she offered Sophie a small, tied paper containing seeds she had saved from a jar. "For when you want to grow something small," she said, her voice steady. Sophie accepted with a blessing that makes small things larger. She promised to plant them in the corner of the garden and watch them with strict attention. Maya knelt in the mud beside Sophie and brushed soil off the child's hands with deft fingers. She did it in the private, intimate way that says more than vows. Hands in soil, small laughter shared, and the ability to be present in the ordinary. Daniel came over and with no grand speech, just a simple, practical touch, put his hand on Maya's shoulder. The gesture was not a claim, it was a recognition. The work had been shared, the life had shifted. Annabel, in that moment, allowed herself a small, private smile. She had been watchful, protective, suspicious at times. But she had also been a woman whose life demanded preservation of a family line and the child's safety. Standing there, she saw a scene that was not perfect, but was real. A child surrounded by adults who had chosen to show up. Later, under the string lights that hung above the greenhouse tables, the little community lingered. Children ran with patched knees and sticky fingers, and elders sat with cups of tea. There was a soft sense that life would continue to ask for attention, and that sometimes the only answer that matters is persistence. Heather did not become a daily presence overnight. She continued to meet the terms the court set: sessions, supervised time, a calendar filled with efforts. On days when she met those terms well, the court considered expanding access. On days she faltered, the court reminded all parties of the child's welfare. It was not a dramatic trajectory. It was instead the slow work of reweaving a thread into a garment. For Sophie, the presence of a mother in varying degrees of access became part of a broader picture in which she learned to keep her own small boundaries and to accept kindnesses from multiple hands. Months later, at bedtime under the hum of a small nightlight, Sophie asked a question that sounded like the simple, essential summary of their new life. "Mama," she said, using the word with the innocent confidence she'd once used for Maya, "can we read the story where the princess finds her garden?" Maya smoothed the cover of the book and smiled. "Of course," she said. Daniel, in the doorway, paused and watched for a second before turning off the hall light. The house, its many rooms, its timid corners, the greenhouse where plants kept unfolding, had the gentle quiet of a place not entirely healed, but held. Outside, the orange sapling pushed a new bud toward the pale sky. It would not bloom into full fruit in a year, not even in 3, but it would root. Roots, they had found, behaved like promises only when tended. The family's work was not finished. They would have to keep tending. Annabel began to call Maya by name with adding qualification. In private, she offered small reparations: an extra jar of preserves, a careful note after a difficult hearing. Charlie kept the ritual of afternoon tea and a plate of cookies by the greenhouse door, as if certain comforts could guarantee nothing but perhaps a steady rhythm. Wanda popped in with the frequency of a friend who was both a comic and a bearer of truth. She would supply the levity the house sometimes needed and was always ready to organize a fundraiser for the community garden. Daniel returned to his work with the newness of someone who had learned to place family before a meeting, sometimes. He had learned the practical art of remaining present. There were hard days, moments when old grief rose up in Daniel like a tide, days when Sophie asked the small but consequential questions that make adults thin. Why did Mommy leave? She asked once, eyes wide, as if trying to find a place for each truth. Daniel, careful, answered as he had practiced, offering the truth in soft measures and giving Sophie the kind of detail a 6-year-old could hold. Some people have trouble with things we can't see. Her being away was not your fault. Sometimes grown-ups have to learn to be better too. Sophie accepted that, and then, the next morning, asked whether they could plant carrots. The small logic of children is often the best moral. Dig, cover, water, wait. The rhythms they learn in a garden, patience, nurture, return, are often the ones the heart needs. Heather, over time, began to build a small routine. A weekly pottery class that gave her hands something to do, a job at a community center helping with evening programs, and a schedule of consistent therapy. The court monitored the progress cautiously. Each success was logged and weighed. She did not become the person she once dreamed of being overnight. People do not. But the days marked incremental forward motion. She paid rent on time, she called on assigned dates, and when Sophie's school recitals happened, Heather was present in the audience, clapping with a guarded, earnest pride. No one in the house treated the process as simple. Forgiveness, reconciliation, and even legal recognition are complicated by regret and habit and memory. Yet there was, in the routines that bound them, the bedtime songs, the greenhouse care, the planting of seeds, an ongoing decision to remain. Sophie's life, the adults agreed through action, mattered more than the need to be right. On a quiet afternoon months after the adoption, Maya and Daniel walked through the garden as neighbors planted late-season herbs. People lingered with small conversations and a sense of community that had been built rather than assumed. They passed the sign, Green Whitmore Garden. The orange sapling had produced a single shy bloom that morning. Maya pointed it out to Sophie, whose eyes went wide with a simple, pure delight of immediate wonder. "You stayed," Sophie said later that night when they sat at the table making pancakes, sticky syrup at their elbows. The sentence was not a question. It was an observation layered with gratitude. Maya smiled at the child, who had been the architect of their unconventional beginning. "I stayed," she repeated. She thought of all the choices she'd made, accepting a child's request in a park, setting boundaries, filing forms, testifying in court, and how they had folded together into a life that now felt whole in its small, everyday ways. Daniel looked at both of them, the child and the woman who had become family, and felt the quietness of something reassembled. He had not expected life to mend so plainly. He had instead expected the ache to find its own shape. Sitting at the table, he reached over and squeezed Maya's hand with a softness that was both apology and gratitude, acknowledgement and something else, an intention to continue to show up. When the season shifted and leaves began to golden on their street, the Whitmore greenhouse lingered in late light, a place where the domestic and the formal had found an uneasy, workable peace. The legal files had been folded into the cabinet. The adoption certificate sat on a shelf in a simple frame. The blog that once buzzed had moved on to another human interest. The private work of repair remained. At the edge of the garden, by the plaque, the sapling spread a little more green. Sophie ran her fingers along the trunk and promised the tree a secret she did not yet understand, that she would water it when it was sad. The adults laughed and let the child hold a responsibility they all recognized as earnest. One evening, as twilight settled, Daniel took out the old portrait of his wife from the study and set it on a small easel near the greenhouse window. He did not put it in the place of command, but he placed it where light could move across it in the afternoon. He had not replaced anything, he had made room. Maya watched him do this and moved to his side. She would have liked the garden, he said. I think she does, Maya answered, in the way she loves things that are tended. They both knew there would be more work ahead. The courts could reopen matters if circumstances changed, relationships could be complicated by old habits, and Heather might make progress that opened new chapters, or stumble in a way that required further protection. But they had survived a storm of public curiosity, a legal process that had tested the limits of what it means to belong, and the private, daily work of keeping a small person safe. They had learned, slowly and imperfectly, that family is a verb as much as it is a noun, something done with hands and time rather than merely declared. On the night that Sophie came home from a school play and declared, without irony, that she wanted to be an astronaut so she could plant a garden on the moon, they all laughed. The kind of laugh that comes when a household convinces itself that the imagination of a child is the most sincere evidence of security. The orange sapling, now taller and more determined, held one small fruit the next summer. It was not much, just a tart, bright thing that tasted of sun and year and commitment. But they celebrated it with a small ceremony of juice about the kitchen table. Sophie toasted with a juice box, eyes shining, and Annabelle offered a tiny formal clink of her teacup. Maya, who had once been a stranger in a second-hand coat smelling faintly of lemon and old paper, had become the person Sophie's small world turned to for solace, for songs, and for a steady hand in mornings. She had not arrived as a savior. She had arrived as someone who answered a child's simple request and then chose, again and again, to remain. The story was not a tidy one. It was a life stitched together by deliberate acts, showing up, telling small truths, honoring routine, setting professional, legal boundaries that prioritized a child, allowing for attempts at reconciliation without abandoning a child's need for safety. Each act reinforced the shape of a family that had been formed by choice and love. Years later, when Sophie would be old enough to read the records and to ask the particulars she could not now imagine, they would tell her the truth simply, that once upon a time she asked a woman in a coat to be a mommy for an afternoon, and that request became a path to a life they built together. They would tell her about the court and the careful steps and the garden and the orange sapling. They would tell her about Heather and the complicated work of rebuilding, and about Annabelle and Charlie, and the people who had kept the rhythm of the house. They would tell her that family can be chosen, but it also takes courage to stay. Sophie, asleep now with a small curl on her forehead and a book closed across her chest, breathed evenly. The house had rearranged itself around the small, essential truths she had always held, that she was loved, that she had a place, that the future could be tended like a pot of seedlings. Outside, the garden held the quiet that only living things can produce when they are being tended. Soft rustles, a bee at work, a small, inconspicuous life insisting on more life. If anyone asked how it had come to be, Daniel would probably answer with something simple and true. A child had asked for a family on a day when his heart was too heavy to invent one himself. A woman had said yes, and then, with ordinary courage, had stayed. If anyone asked Maya why she had decided to stay, she would say what she had once told Wanda in a quick message that had no legal weight, but was exact in its ethics. Because someone needed a hand, and because caring is where I belong. She would say, too, that the house taught her about patience, and that the court taught her about limits, and that if anyone had to choose between being right and being present, she preferred the present. The green Whitmore garden kept growing. The sapling, the plaque, and the small fruit were not endings. They were the evidence of a beginning that needed tending. Every morning someone watered it. Sometimes Sophie, sometimes Daniel, sometimes a neighbor who had come to feel as if the garden and the family around it were a little of their own. At night, when the lights dimmed and the house found its softer frequency, Maya sometimes sat by the greenhouse and hummed the lullaby she had once promised to bring to a birthday party. Daniel would pass her by and not say anything. No words were necessary. Presence, in the end, was what they had all learned to offer one another, the daily reply to a child's small, brave asking. If you found yourself moved by Sophie's question at the start, or if this story reminded you of someone who showed up for you when it mattered, share it with them. And if you'd like to hear more stories where small acts change lives, consider subscribing for more.